David Richardson had been the FBI director for 3 years, but today he just wanted to get home to his family. The classified briefing at the regional office had run longer than expected, and now the afternoon sun was beating down on his government, sudden as he drove through the quiet suburbs of Millbrook Heights. This wasn't his usual route home, but construction on the highway had forced him to take this detour through one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the county. The houses here were massive, with perfectly manicured lawns and circular driveways that could fit 4 cars easily. David had grown up in a neighborhood where houses were close together, and kids played in the streets until their mothers called them home for dinner. This place felt different, sterile, almost like a movie set where everything was too perfect to be real. He was thinking about his daughter's soccer game tomorrow when he heard the first sputter from his engine. The car jerked slightly, then smoothed out. David frowned and checked the dashboard. All the lights looked normal. Maybe it was just his imagination. But then it happened again, stronger this time, and the engine made a grinding noise that definitely wasn't normal. "Come on, not today," he muttered, pulling over to the curb in front of a house that probably cost more than most people made in 5 years. The engine died completely as soon as he put the car in park. David sat there for a moment, running his hand over his face. He was wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt since the briefing had been informal. His federal credentials were in his wallet and his badge was clipped inside his jacket, but he looked like any regular guy having car trouble. He pulled out his phone to call for roadside assistance, but the signal was weak in this area. He stepped out of the car and popped the hood, though he knew very little about engines. The heat hit him immediately and he loosened his collar. As he bent over to look at the engine, he noticed a woman across the street watching him from her window. She had her phone pressed to her ear, and when she saw him looking, she quickly moved away from the window. That was odd, but David didn't think much of it. He tried his phone again and managed to get through to the federal motor pool. They told him a tow truck would be there in about 30 minutes. He thanked them and hung up, deciding to wait in the shade under a large oak tree on the sidewalk. More people were watching him now. He could feel their eyes on him from behind curtains and through barely open doors. A man in his 60s came out to get his mail and stared at David for a long moment before going back inside. David heard the distinct sound of a deadbolt being turned. This was getting uncomfortable. David had experienced this kind of scrutiny before, and he knew exactly what it was about. In his expensive suits and federal buildings, he was Director Richardson, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. But here, in jeans and a casual shirt standing next to a broken-down car, he was just another black man in a neighborhood where black men weren't expected to belong. He checked his watch. 20 minutes until the tow truck arrived. He could handle 20 minutes of suspicious looks. He'd handled much worse in his career. A police cruiser turned onto the street moving slowly. David saw it coming and felt a familiar tightness in his chest. This could go smoothly if the officers were professional, but experience had taught him that wasn't always the case. The cruiser pulled up behind his sedan, and 2 officers got out. The first officer was tall and thin, probably in his early 30s, with short blonde hair and mirrored sunglasses. His name tag read Blake. The second officer was shorter and stockier, maybe 40 years old, with a mustache and a swagger that David had seen too many times before. His name tag said Torres. "Afternoon," Officer Blake called out as they approached. His tone was neutral, but David could sense the tension underneath. "We got some calls about someone suspicious in the neighborhood. You having car trouble?" David nodded and gestured toward his sedan. "Yes, sir. Engine just died on me. I've got a tow truck coming." "Uh-huh," Sergeant Torres said, stopping about 6 feet away and resting his hand on his belt near his weapon. "And what brings you to this particular neighborhood?" The question was loaded, and they all knew it. David kept his voice calm and respectful. "I was driving home from work and had to take a detour because of construction on Route 35. That's when my car broke down." "Where do you work?" Blake asked, taking out a small notebook. "I work for the federal government," David replied. This was the moment of truth. He could tell them exactly who he was, but experience had taught him that sometimes it was better to let these situations unfold naturally. Torres snorted. "Federal government, huh? Doing what exactly?" Law enforcement, David said simply. The two officers exchanged a look. Torres stepped closer, his attitude becoming more aggressive. You got some ID to prove that? Of course. David slowly reached for his wallet, making sure to keep his movements deliberate and visible. The last thing he wanted was for either officer to feel threatened. He pulled out his wallet and opened it to show his federal credentials. Torres snatched the wallet from his hands before David could object. He looked at the ID for barely 2 seconds before laughing. This is fake as hell. FBI director? Really? You think we're stupid? David felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. Sir, those credentials are genuine. I can provide you with a number to call to verify my identity. Save it, Blake said, moving to David's other side. We've seen plenty of fake IDs before. The question is, what are you really doing here? Several neighbors had come out of their houses now, standing on their porches and watching the scene unfold. David could hear them talking in low voices. Their words carried on the breeze. I knew something was wrong, one woman said. He's been casing houses for 20 minutes. David realized how this must look to them. A black man in casual clothes, standing around their neighborhood looking at their houses. The fact that he was waiting for a tow truck didn't matter to them. The fact that he was one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the country didn't matter either, because they couldn't see past the color of his skin. Torres was still examining David's credentials, but David could tell he wasn't really looking at them. He was just going through the motions, having already decided that everything was fake. These look pretty professional, Torres said mockingly. Must have cost you a lot to get these made. Too bad you're going to jail. Anyway, the tow truck would be here in less than 10 minutes. David just needed to stay calm and let this play out. Once his identity was verified, this whole situation would be over. But as he looked at the two officers and saw the certainty in their eyes, he began to wonder if they would even bother to verify anything at all. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than David had expected. Torres was holding his federal credentials like they were pieces of garbage, while Blake circled around behind him. David could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching from the expensive houses that lined the street. This was exactly the kind of scenario they covered in training, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different. Look, officers, David said, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. I understand you're just doing your job, but if you'll just make one phone call to verify those credentials, this whole misunderstanding can be cleared up in minutes. Torres laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Misunderstanding? The only misunderstanding here is you thinking we're going to fall for this elaborate scam. He waved the federal ID in the air. FBI director, do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds? Blake stepped closer from behind. Turn around and put your hands on the car. We're going to search you. David's heart sank. He had hoped they would at least listen to reason, but it was clear these officers had already made up their minds about who they thought he was. Officers, I'm going to comply with your request, but I'm telling you again that I'm a federal law enforcement official. Those credentials are real. Yeah, right, Torres muttered, and I'm the President of the United States. David slowly turned around and placed his hands on the roof of his sedan. The metal was hot from sitting in the sun, and he could feel the heat through his palms. Blake immediately began patting him down, his hands rough and aggressive. It was clear this wasn't a professional search, it was meant to humiliate. What do we have here? Blake said, reaching into David's jacket and pulling out his federal badge. The gold shield caught the sunlight as Blake held it up for Torres to see. Looks like our friend here really went all out with his costume. Torres snatched the badge from Blake's hand and examined it with exaggerated interest. This is pretty good work. Probably got it made at one of those novelty shops downtown. I bet he's got business cards too that say he's the FBI director. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk now. David could hear their conversations, and every word felt like a knife. I called this in 20 minutes ago, an older woman was saying. I knew he was up to no good the moment I saw him. Thank goodness the police got here before he could break into someone's house, another voice added. David closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. These people had looked at him and immediately assumed the worst, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he looked like. It was a painful reminder that no matter how high he climbed in his career, no matter how much respect he earned in professional circles, there would always be people who saw him as a threat first and a human being second. "Empty your pockets," Blake ordered, his tone becoming more aggressive. By the minute, David carefully removed his phone, his keys, and some loose change. Blake grabbed the phone immediately. "Nice phone," he said with a smirk. "Federal government must pay pretty well for fake agents." Torres was going through David's wallet now, pulling out credit cards and cash. "Look at this," he said, holding up several $100 bills. "Where'd you get all this money? You been selling drugs in this neighborhood?" "That's my personal money," David replied, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "I stopped at the bank this morning." "Sure you did," Torres said, stuffing the cash into his own pocket. "We'll just hold on to this as evidence." David watched in disbelief as Torres pocketed his money. This wasn't just racial profiling anymore, it was theft. "Officer, you just took my personal property without any legal justification." Blake pushed David harder against the car. "Legal justification? You're standing in a neighborhood where you don't belong, carrying fake federal credentials and walking around with a suspicious amount of cash. That's all the justification we need." The tow truck David had been waiting for finally appeared at the end of the street, but Torres waved it away before it could reach them. "Nothing to see here," he called out to the driver. "Move along." David watched helplessly as his ride home disappeared around the corner. Now he was completely at the mercy of these two officers who had already decided he was guilty of something. "You know what I think?" Torres said, still going through David's belongings. "I think you've been casing this neighborhood for weeks, figuring out which houses to hit. That's why you had all these fake credentials ready in case you got caught." "That's completely false," David said. "My car broke down and I was waiting for assistance, that's all." Blake pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Well, you can tell that story to the judge. You're under arrest for suspicious activity, carrying false identification, and resisting arrest." "I haven't resisted anything," David protested. "I've been completely cooperative." "Arguing with police officers is resisting arrest," Torres said with a grin. "Turn around." David had no choice but to comply. As Blake snapped the handcuffs on his wrists, David felt them tighten more than necessary. "These are too tight," he said. "They're supposed to be tight," Blake replied. "That's how handcuffs work." Torres was still going through David's belongings. He picked up David's expensive watch and examined it closely. "This is pretty nice," he said. "Probably stolen, but nice. We'll need to hold on to this too as evidence." David watched as Torres removed his watch and put it in his own pocket, right next to the cash he had already taken. "Officers, what you're doing is theft. I want to speak to your supervisor." "Your supervisor?" Torres laughed. "You'll be lucky if you get a phone call where you're going." The crowd of neighbors was getting larger, and David could hear them talking about him like he wasn't even there. "I hope they search him thoroughly," one man was saying. "No telling what else he might be carrying." "This neighborhood has been so safe until recently," a woman added. "Now we have to worry about people like him coming around." People like him. The word stung more than David wanted to admit. These people didn't know anything about him, his education, his career, his family, his contributions to law enforcement. All they saw was his skin color, and that was enough for them to assume he was a criminal. Blake grabbed David's arm and started walking him toward the police car. "Come on, let's go. You've got a nice cell waiting for you downtown." As they approached the cruiser, Torres called out to the crowd of neighbors. "Don't worry, folks. We got him. Your neighborhood is safe again." The neighbors actually applauded. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. These people were celebrating his arrest based on nothing more than their own prejudices and assumptions. Blake opened the back door of the police car and pushed David's head down as he guided him into the seat. The handcuffs made it impossible to sit comfortably, and the plastic seats were already hot from the afternoon sun. As the police car pulled away from the curb, David looked back at his sedan, still sitting broken down on the side of the road. In 30 minutes, his life had been turned completely upside down by two officers who refused to listen, and neighbors who had judged him before he had even spoken a word. But David Richardson hadn't become FBI director by giving up when things got difficult. He would get through this, and when he did, there would be consequences for everyone involved. The ride to the police station felt like the longest 15 minutes of David's life. The back seat of the police cruiser smelled like disinfectant and fear, and the handcuffs were cutting into his wrists. Blake was driving while Torres sat in the passenger seat, both of them talking about David like he wasn't even there. "Can you believe this guy?" Torres was saying. "Fake FBI credentials and everything. He really thought we'd fall for that." Blake glanced at David in the rearview mirror. "Probably been planning this for months. Good thing those neighbors called it in when they did." David stared out the window at the familiar streets of the city where he had worked for over a decade. He had driven these same roads countless times in his official capacity, meeting with local law enforcement, coordinating federal investigations, attending community events. Now he was seeing them from the back of a police car, treated like a common criminal. The police station was a gray brick building that David had visited many times before, though never under these circumstances. Blake pulled into the parking garage and got out to open David's door. "Come on, let's go meet your new friends." They walked David through a side entrance that led directly to the booking area. The fluorescent lights were harsh and flickering, casting everything in an unforgiving glare. Several officers looked up as they entered, and David could see the curiosity in their eyes. "What do we have here?" asked a female officer sitting behind the desk. Her nameplate read, "Officer Martinez," and she looked to be in her late 30s with short dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude. Torres grinned as he approached the desk. "Caught this guy casing houses in Millbrook Heights. He's got fake federal credentials and everything. Claims he's an FBI director, if you can believe that." Martinez looked David up and down, taking in his jeans and casual shirt. Then she burst out laughing. "FBI director? Really? That's a new one. Usually they claim to be lawyers or doctors." "I know, right?" Blake chimed in. He even had a fake badge made. Pretty convincing stuff, but not convincing enough. David stood quietly as they talked about him. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to let people reveal who they really were. These officers were showing their true colors, with every word they spoke. Martinez stood up and walked around the desk to get a better look at David. "So you're telling me this guy standing here in jeans and a wrinkled shirt claims to be the director of the FBI?" "That's exactly what he claims," Torres said, pulling David's credentials out of his pocket and waving them in the air. "Look at these fake IDs he was carrying. Pretty professional looking, I'll give him that." Martinez took the credentials and glanced at them for about 2 seconds before tossing them on her desk. "Nice try, but we've seen it all before. You'd be surprised how many people think fake government IDs will get them out of trouble." A few other officers had gathered around now, attracted by the commotion. David recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same look he had seen from the neighbors in Millbrook Heights. They had already decided who he was and what he was capable of, and nothing he could say would change their minds. "Can I make a phone call?" David asked quietly. Torres snorted. "Phone call? You think this is a hotel? You'll get your phone call when we're good and ready to give it to you." Blake was already going through David's pockets again, pulling out his keys and examining them. "Nice car keys," he said. "BMW, huh? I wonder how someone like you affords a car like that." "Probably stolen," Martinez suggested. "We should run those plates and see what comes up." David watched as Blake pocketed his keys, adding them to the growing collection of his personal belongings that the officers were helping themselves to. "Those keys belong to a federal vehicle," David said. "Taking them is a federal crime." This only made the officers laugh harder. "Federal vehicle," Torres repeated, slapping his knee. "This guy just keeps getting better and better." Martinez opened a door that led to the holding cells. "Come on, Director," she said mockingly. "Let's get you settled into your luxury accommodations." The holding area was exactly what David had expected. Concrete walls, metal benches, and the smell of too many unwashed bodies in too small a space. There were already 3 other men in the main holding cell, and they looked up with interest as David was brought in. "Fresh meat," one of them called out, a man with missing teeth and tattoos covering his arms. "What you in for, suit?" Blake unlocked the cell door and pushed David inside. "This gentleman claims to be the FBI director," he announced to the other prisoners. "Thought you guys might get a kick out of that." The prisoners erupted in laughter. "FBI director?" the tattooed man wheezed. "That's rich. I'm the president of Mars myself." David found a spot on the metal bench and sat down carefully, the handcuffs still cutting into his wrists. Blake finally removed them, but not before making sure they left marks. Outside the cell, the officers were having the time of their lives. Torres had pulled out David's expensive watch and was showing it off to Martinez. "Look at this thing," he said. "Must be worth at least $5,000. Evidence locker's getting pretty full these days." Martinez examined the watch with obvious envy. "That's a beautiful piece. Real shame it's evidence in a criminal case. Might have to sit in that locker for years and years." Blake was counting the cash they had taken from David's wallet. $340, he announced. "Not bad for a day's work. Don't forget to log all that evidence properly," Martinez said with a wink that everyone could see. "We want to make sure everything is accounted for." The officers burst into laughter again, and David realized they had no intention of logging anything. They were dividing up his belongings like pirates splitting treasure, confident that no one would believe a word he said. One of the prisoners, a younger man with kind eyes, sat down next to David on the bench. "What did you really do?" he asked, quietly. "My car broke down," David replied. "That's all?" The young man nodded sadly. "Yeah, I know how that goes. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong color. Story of my life." David looked around the cell at his fellow prisoners. They were all black or Hispanic, all wearing the same defeated expression that came from being in a system that seemed designed to work against them. How many of them were actually guilty of crimes? How many were just like David, caught up in a situation that spiraled out of control? Back at the desk, the officers were still entertaining themselves at David's expense. Torres had found David's federal phone and was pretending to make important government calls. "Hello, this is the FBI director," he said in an exaggerated voice. "I need you to arrest all the bad guys right away." Martinez was taking pictures with David's badge, posing like she was accepting an award. "This is going straight to social media," she said. "My friends are never going to believe this." Blake was trying on David's watch, admiring how it looked on his wrist. "You know what? I think this watch suits me. Might have to hold on to it for safekeeping." David closed his eyes and tried to center himself. He had been in difficult situations before: hostage negotiations, terrorist threats, organized crime, investigations. But this was different. This was personal. These officers weren't just doing their jobs badly. They were enjoying his humiliation. The minutes ticked by slowly. David's phone would have been ringing by now. Missed meetings, worried, staff members, security protocols being triggered. His absence wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Someone would start looking for him soon. But as he sat in that cell, surrounded by the laughter of officers who saw him as nothing more than entertainment, David wondered if anyone would think to look for him here. After all, who would believe that the director of the FBI was sitting in a local jail cell, arrested for the crime of having car trouble while black? The answer to that question was coming sooner than anyone expected. David had been in the holding cell for exactly 6 minutes. When the phone rang, the sound cut through the laughter and chatter of the officers who were still entertaining themselves with his belongings. Martinez was showing Torres how David's watch looked on her wrist while Blake pretended to give orders using David's federal badge as a prop. The desk phone rang again, loud and insistent. Martinez sighed and walked over to answer it, still wearing David's watch. "Millbrook Police Department, Officer Martinez speaking." David looked up from the metal bench where he had been sitting quietly, watching the circus unfold around him. Something about the phone call felt different. There was an urgency to the ringing that hadn't been there before. "Yes, this is Officer Martinez," she repeated, her voice already changing tone. "Who is this?" The other prisoners in the cell had noticed the shift too. The tattooed man who had been making jokes earlier was now watching Martinez with interest. Even Blake and Torres had stopped their game with David's belongings and were listening to the conversation. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Martinez said, her face going pale. "Did you say Deputy Director Chen from FBI headquarters?" David felt his heart rate increase, but he remained perfectly still. Finally, someone had noticed he was missing. Martinez was frantically waving at Blake and Torres now, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "Yes, ma'am. This is a police station. May I ask what this is regarding?" There was a long pause as Martinez listened to the voice on the other end of the line. David could see the exact moment when the reality of the situation began to dawn on her. Her hand started shaking and she nearly dropped the phone. "You're looking for, you said FBI Director David Richardson?" Martinez's voice was barely above a whisper now. Blake and Torres had stopped what they were doing completely. The playful atmosphere in the station evaporated in an instant, replaced by a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Ma'am, can you hold for just one moment, please?" Martinez put the call on hold and turned to stare at David through the bars of the holding cell. For the first time since he had been arrested, she was really looking at him, not at what she expected to see, but at who was actually sitting there. "Blake," she whispered, "get Captain Williams down here right now." Blake was already moving, his face white as a sheet. "Torres," he hissed, "give me that wallet back. Now!" Torres fumbled in his pocket and pulled out David's credentials, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. For the first time, he actually looked at the ID carefully, reading every word, examining every detail. "Oh no," he breathed. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." The other prisoners were watching this unfold with fascination. The tattooed man leaned over to David and whispered, "Something tells me you really are who you said you were." David just nodded calmly. He had known this moment would come. The only question had been how long it would take. Martinez took the call off hold, her voice shaking. "Deputy Director Chen? Yes, I'm still here. Could you describe Director Richardson?" "For me, please." As she listened to the description, Martinez's eyes never left David's face. With each detail, height, age, distinguishing features, her expression grew more horrified. "Ma'am," she finally managed, I think we may have a situation here." Captain Williams came rushing down the stairs, still buttoning his uniform shirt. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect. When he saw the looks on his officers' faces, he knew immediately that something was very wrong. "What's going on down here?" he demanded. Martinez held out the phone with a trembling hand. "Captain, there's a Deputy Director Chen from FBI headquarters on the line. She's looking for Director Richardson." Captain Williams took the phone, still not understanding the full scope of what was happening. "This is Captain Williams. How can I help you?" David could hear both sides of the conversation now, and he watched as the captain's face went through the same transformation that Martinez's had. First confusion, then disbelief, then pure horror. "Ma'am, can you give me a description of Director Richardson?" the captain asked, though David could tell he already knew what the answer would be. As the description was given, Captain Williams slowly turned to look at the holding cell. When his eyes met David's, the captain's face went completely white. "Deputy Director Chen," the captain said carefully, "I'm going to have to call you back in just a few minutes. There's been a situation." He hung up the phone and stood there, for a moment staring at David like he was seeing a ghost. "Open that cell," he said quietly. "Open it right now." Blake was fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the lock. "Captain, we didn't know. He didn't have proper identification. The neighbors called and said, 'Just open the cell,'" Captain Williams said, his voice deadly calm. The cell door swung open, and David stood up slowly, straightening his shirt with quiet dignity. He walked out of the cell like he was walking out of a board meeting, his head held high despite everything he had been through. "Director Richardson," Captain Williams said, his voice barely audible. "Sir, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am." David looked at the 3 officers who had arrested him, humiliated him, and stolen his belongings. Torres was holding his watch in one hand and his cash in the other, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Blake was clutching David's federal phone, and Martinez was frantically trying to remove David's watch from her wrist. "My belongings," David said simply. The officers practically fell over themselves trying to return everything. Torres shoved the cash and watch at David with shaking hands. Blake held out the federal phone like it was radioactive. Martinez finally got the watch off her wrist and offered it to David with tears in her eyes. David put his watch back on and counted the cash carefully before putting it in his wallet. He clipped his badge back inside his jacket and took his federal phone, checking for missed calls. There were 17. Director Richardson, Captain Williams said, his voice cracking slightly. This is the worst mistake this department has ever made. I don't know how to begin to make this right. David looked around the station, at the officers who had mocked him, at the desk where they had divided up his belongings, at the cell where they had locked him up for the crime of being black in the wrong neighborhood. You can start, David said quietly, by explaining to Deputy Director Chen exactly what happened here when she calls back. As if on cue, the phone rang again. Captain Williams looked at it like it was a bomb about to explode. That would be her now, David continued. And Captain, I suggest you tell her the truth. All of it. The captain answered the phone with a shaking hand. Deputy Director Chen? Yes, this is Captain Williams again. Ma'am, we have Director Richardson here at our station, and I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding. David could hear Deputy Director Chen's voice getting louder through the phone, even though he couldn't make out the words. Captain Williams held the phone away from his ear and winced. Yes, ma'am, he's safe. But ma'am, I need to tell you that he was arrested by my officers. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then came a voice so cold and furious that even David felt a chill. You arrested the director of the FBI? Captain Williams looked like he was about to be sick. Yes, ma'am. There's going to be a full investigation and the officers involved will be disciplined immediately. Disciplined? The deputy director's voice was ice. Captain, this isn't a disciplinary matter anymore. This is a federal case. I'm sending agents to your location immediately. David watched as Torres, Blake, and Martinez exchanged terrified looks. They were finally beginning to understand that this wasn't going to end with a slap on the wrist or a few days of suspension. The game was over, and they had lost everything. The next hour passed like a slow-motion nightmare for Torres, Blake, and Martinez. David sat calmly in Captain Williams' office while the captain made phone call after phone call, each conversation more painful than the last. David could see the three officers through the glass window, sitting at their desks like condemned prisoners waiting for their fate to be decided. Director Richardson, Captain Williams said after hanging up from his fourth call to the mayor's office, I've suspended all three officers immediately. They'll be escorted off the premises within the hour. David nodded but didn't say anything. He was watching Torres, who kept looking at his hands like he couldn't believe what he had done with them. The man who had been so confident just an hour ago now looked like he was about to be sick. Sir, the captain continued, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that this department has never had an incident like this before. These officers acted completely outside of their training and our policies. David turned to look at Captain Williams. The man was clearly devastated, and David could see that he was genuinely trying to make things right. But some things couldn't be fixed with apologies and suspensions. Captain, David said quietly, can you honestly tell me this is the first time these officers have treated someone this way? Or is this just the first time they did it to someone who had the power to fight back? The question hung in the air like a weight. Captain Williams opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. Again. David could see the truth in his eyes. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time they had been caught. Through the window, David could see Martinez crying at her desk. Blake was staring at his computer screen, but David could tell he wasn't actually reading anything. Torres had his head in his hands, finally understanding that his career in law enforcement was over. The front door of the station opened, and 4 FBI agents walked in wearing dark suits and serious expressions. David recognized Agent Thompson from his security detail, along with Agent Rodriguez from Internal Affairs. The other 2 were from the Civil Rights Division. David had requested them specifically. Director Richardson? Agent Thompson approached the captain's office with obvious relief. Sir, are you all right? David stood up and straightened his jacket. I'm fine, Agent Thompson, though I think we have some work to do here. Captain Williams stood up as well, his face pale as he realized that federal agents were now involved. "Director, these agents are here to investigate federal civil rights violations," David replied calmly, "and theft of federal property, and assault on a federal officer." The captain's legs seemed to give out, and he sat down heavily in his chair. "Federal charges?" Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with a folder full of paperwork. "Captain Williams, we're going to need to speak with Officers Torres, Blake, and Martinez immediately. This is now a federal investigation." David watched through the window as the three officers were called into separate rooms. Martinez was sobbing openly now, while Blake kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe this was happening. Torres looked like he was in shock, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. "Director," Agent Thompson said, "we've also been in contact with the neighbors who called in the initial complaint. Several of them want to speak with you personally to apologize." David almost smiled at that. "I bet they do." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same neighbors who had watched his arrest with satisfaction were now desperate to distance themselves from what had happened. They had probably spent the last hour frantically calling anyone they could think of, trying to find a way to make this go away. Captain Williams was on the phone again, this time with someone from the district attorney's office. David could hear bits of the conversation, words like federal jurisdiction and civil rights violation and career ending. "Sir," Agent Rodriguez said, approaching David with a recording device, "when you're ready, we'd like to get your full statement about what happened." David nodded. "Of course, but first I want to speak with the three officers." Agent Thompson looked surprised. "Sir, I'm not sure that's advisable. They'll have lawyers present, and anything you say could potentially complicate the prosecution." "I'm not going to say anything that will help them," David replied. "But I want them to understand exactly what they've done." 30 minutes later, David found himself in an interrogation room facing Torres, Blake, and Martinez. Their union representatives sat beside them, looking almost as uncomfortable as the officers themselves. The lawyers had advised their clients to say nothing, but David wasn't interested in getting confessions. He had something else in mind. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" David asked, his voice calm and measured. "It's not that you arrested me. It's not even that you stole my belongings or put me in a cell. The worst part is that you enjoyed it." Martinez was crying again, but David continued. "You took pleasure in humiliating someone you thought was powerless. You laughed at my credentials because you couldn't imagine that someone who looks like me could hold a position of authority." Blake tried to speak, but his lawyer quickly put a hand on his arm to stop him. "The three of you represent everything that's wrong with policing in this country," David continued. "You see certain people as automatic threats, and you use your badges to justify your prejudices." Torres finally looked up, his eyes red and exhausted. "Director Richardson," he said quietly, ignoring his lawyer's frantic gestures, "I don't know what to say. I was wrong. We were all wrong." "Yes, you were," David agreed. "But being wrong isn't a crime. What you did after you were wrong, that's what's going to destroy your lives." David stood up and walked to the door, then turned back one more time. "You had multiple opportunities to verify my identity. You had chances to listen, to show basic human decency, to treat me with the respect you would show any citizen. Instead, you chose to mock me, rob me, and humiliate me. That was your choice." As David left the room, he could hear Martinez sobbing harder. Blake was staring at the table, and Torres looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. The news crews had arrived by the time David walked out of the police station. Reporters shouted questions as Agent Thompson and his security detail escorted David to his waiting car, but David didn't stop to answer them. He had nothing to say to the media right now. But 3 days later, David held a press conference that was broadcast nationwide. Standing at a podium in front of FBI headquarters, he spoke directly to the cameras about what had happened. What occurred in Millbrook was not an isolated incident, he said. It was a symptom of a much larger problem that exists in law enforcement across this country. People of color are routinely treated as suspects first and citizens second, regardless of their actual circumstances. The questions from reporters came fast and furious. How did it feel to be arrested? Would he be pressing charges? What changes would he recommend? I will be working with Congress to develop new training programs for local law enforcement, David announced. Programs that focus on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and proper verification procedures. What happened to me happens to ordinary citizens every day. They just don't have the platform to speak about it that I do. 2 weeks later, Torres, Blake, and Martinez were all charged with federal civil rights violations, theft, and assault on a federal officer. They pleaded guilty to avoid trial, but their sentences were still significant. 2 years in federal prison for Torres and Blake, 18 months for Martinez. Captain Williams resigned from the police force and took a job as a security guard at a shopping mall. The Millbrook Police Department implemented new policies for identity verification and bias training, largely based on recommendations from David's task force. The neighbors who had called in the initial complaint found themselves the subject of a separate investigation into housing discrimination patterns in their neighborhood. Several of them moved away rather than deal with the ongoing scrutiny. But perhaps the most important change was the legislation that David helped draft and push through Congress. The Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act required all local police departments receiving federal funding to implement bias training and establish civilian oversight boards. 6 months after his arrest, David returned to Millbrook Heights for the first time. Not in a broken-down car, but in an official FBI vehicle with a full security detail. He was there to speak at a community meeting about police reform and racial justice. The same neighbors who had watched his arrest with satisfaction now sat in an auditorium listening to him speak about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or appearance. As David looked out at the crowd, he thought about that day when his car broke down. In some ways, it had been the worst day of his career, but it had also become one of the most important. Sometimes the greatest changes come from the darkest moments, and sometimes justice arrives exactly when it's needed most. The 3 officers who had thought they were arresting just another black man had instead arrested the one person with the power to make sure their actions had lasting consequences. Not just for them, but for the entire system they represented. And that, David thought, was exactly what justice looked like.